What's up, everybody? This is the 1950s Robbers Cave experiment. And usually I try to give you guys the facts, and then if I have thoughts on it, I'll throw that in at the end. But I want to plant a few seeds in your head before we even get going here, because if you understand the full ramifications of this should piss you off. Especially in light of what we just talked about in the last video in the state of race relations in America. All of these problems we face that they're trying to blame on ethnicity and your lack of acceptance has absolutely nothing to do with anyone's genetics. It's just human nature, pure and simple, and how tribalism arises out of a need for self-preservation. Only what we have now has nothing to do with self-preservation. It has to do with the dark side of psychology being used against entire nations. One thing I realized while reading this is, we've talked about before how naive Americans were from the 1930s, around the World War II era up until 2001. And I thought it's a lot like an animal that has lost its natural predators. People were incredibly trusting and naive, and why wouldn't they be? We're all friends here. We don't have city walls up. We know the Canadians aren't going to come down and invade us, but all the while, the enemy was within. And still is. So before we start here, I just want you to think of professional sports ball, lifelong rivals and animosity. A little closer to home, think of high school sports. Everybody's got their team colors and big banners all across the gymnasium walls of the years that your team went to state. You've got your team mascot, and your team's the best. Screw those losers that live 15 miles up the road if you live in the country like I did. If you live in the city, then it's the guys that live 6 blocks over. But my experience was a little bit different due to the fact that I lived right on a state line. And there were towns on both sides of the state line that would have just been one town had the state line not ran through there. Well, you don't play against teams from other states, so we were all good. They were the Bears, and we had no problem with the Bears because we weren't rivals. But that little town 15 miles up the road in my state, screw those guys and every other school in our district. Well, let me tell you, none of that's by accident. The Robbers Cave experiment, conducted by Muzaffar Sharif in the 1950s, studied intergroup conflict and cooperation among 22 boys in Oklahoma. Initially separated into 2 groups, they developed group identities, and introducing competitive tasks led to hostility between groups. Now, this is one of the most cited psychological experiments ever, and a lot of people have their different takes on it. Here they say, later, cooperative tasks reduce this conflict, highlighting the role of shared goals in resolving group tensions. Well, Mr. Sunshine is writing this article because what he's ignoring is that for a lot of these boys, the intergroup conflict, the animosity never went away, and there was nothing you could do to make it go away. Now, let's say that's only 25% of the group. Well, that's 25% of people harboring a resentment towards other people for no other reason than they were on the other team, and that resentment lasts for life. The following hypotheses were tested. When individuals who don't know each other are brought together to interact in group activities to achieve common goals, they produce a group structure with hierarchical statuses and roles. 2. Once formed, 2 in-groups are brought into functional relationship under conditions of competition, and group frustration, attitudes, and appropriate hostile actions about the outgroup and its members will arise. These will be standardized and shared in varying degrees by group members. The field experiment involved 2 groups of 12-year-old boys at Robbers Cave State Park, Oklahoma. The 22 boys in the study were unknown to each other and all from white middle-class backgrounds. They all shared a Protestant 2-parent background. The researchers randomly divided the boys into 2 groups, with efforts being made to balance the group's physical, mental, and social talents. Neither group was aware of the other's existence. They were then, as individual groups, picked up by bus on successive days in the summer of 1954 and transported to a 200-acre Boy Scouts of America camp in the Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. So let me emphasize here that this was a study done on Protestant white middle class children who, for all intents and purposes, are virtually identical. So you can only imagine how much the animosity would be exacerbated by people from different backgrounds. Also, who do you think funded this study? Yale University and the Department for Scientific Research of the. Yeah. So, in essence, this was paid for by American tax dollars to study how to divide virtually identical people from each other. Oh, but they're just an advocacy group standing up for the rights of so and so to exist and blah, blah, blah. Well, wait a minute. If these were the hammies that came into America and ran this study, would I then have the right to be pissed about this? We're back to that BS double standard I talked about last video. Phase 1, in-group formation, 5 to 6 days. The members of each group got to know one another, social norms developed, leadership and group structure emerged. At the camp, the groups were kept separate from each other and were encouraged to bond as two individual groups through the pursuit of common goals that required cooperative discussion, planning, and execution. During this first phase, the groups did not know of the other group's existence. The boys developed an attachment to their groups throughout the first week of the camp, quickly establishing their own cultures and group norms by doing various activities together like hiking, swimming, etc. The boys chose names for their groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and stenciled them onto shirts and flags. Phase 2, group conflict, 4 to 5 days. The now formed groups came into contact with each other, competing in games and challenges and competing for control of territory. Sharif now arranged the competition stage, where friction between the groups was to occur over the next 4 to 6 days. In this phase, it was intended to bring the two groups into competition with each other in conditions that would create frustration between them. A series of competitive activities, like basketball, tug of war, were arranged with a trophy being awarded on the basis of accumulated team score. There were also individual prizes for the winning group, such as a medal and multi-bladed pocket knives, with no consolation prizes being given to the losers. Now, I once heard somebody talking about this, and they said, the 1950s where you gave bladed weapons to children. And I'm just thinking, well, I'm sorry you weren't raised as a boy. Because to a 12-year-old boy, there ain't much out there that beats a pocket knife. Maybe an axe, but that's hard to carry around with you. But I'm pretty sure the person that opined that was raised up in the everybody gets a trophy generation, which we'll get to. The Rattlers' reaction to the informal announcement of a series of contests was absolute confidence in their victory. They spent all day talking about the contests and making improvements on the ball field, which they took over as their own to such an extent that they spoke of putting a keep off sign there. They ended up putting their Rattler flag on the pitch. At this time, several Rattlers made threatening remarks about what they would do if anybody from the Eagles bothered their flag. Situations were also devised whereby one group gained at the expense of the other. For example, one group was delayed getting to a picnic, and when they arrived, the other group had eaten their food. Now, this is why I put unethical in the title. I'm pretty sure Sharif would be jailed today for this. At first, this prejudice was only verbally expressed, such as through taunting or name-calling. As the competitions wore on, this expression took a more direct route. The Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. Then the next day, the Rattlers ransacked the Eagles' cabin, overturned beds, and stole private property. The groups became so aggressive with each other that the researchers had to physically separate them. During the subsequent 2-day cooling-off period, the boys listed features of the two groups. The boys tended to characterize their own in-group in very favorable terms and the other out-group in very unfavorable terms. Keep in mind that the participants in this study were well-adjusted boys, not street thugs. This study clearly shows that conflict between groups can trigger prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behavior. This experiment confirmed Sharif's realistic conflict theory. which I'm not sure if it'll be cited in this write-up, but there was a drunken brawl between Sharif and one of the other researchers because Sharif was clearly crossing moral boundaries and pushing more than he should have. Phase 3, conflict resolution, 6 to 7 days. Sharif and colleagues tried various means of reducing the animosity and low-level violins between the groups. The Robbers Cave experiments showed that superordinate goals that are so large that it requires more than one group to achieve the goal, reduced conflict significantly more and effectively than other strategies like communication or contact. A number of improvised reconciliatorial opportunities, such as beanbag collecting contest or the showing of a film or the shooting off of firecrackers to celebrate the 4th of July, did not lead to any appreciable lessening of tensions between the Eagles and the Rattlers. Sharif concluded that such contrived contact opportunities were not going to lessen tension between the two groups. They now arranged for the introduction of a number of scenarios presenting superordinate goals which members of the two antagonistic groups could not easily ignore, but the attainment of which was beyond the resources and efforts of one group alone. These scenarios were played out at a new location in the belief that this would tend to inhibit recall of grievances that had been experienced at Robbers Cave. This brings to mind Ronald Reagan saying, if we only had an enemy from outer space come down, then we would all unite together. The drinking water problem. The first superordinate goal to be introduced concerned a common resource used by both groups, their water supply, which had suddenly stopped flowing. All of the drinking water in the camp came from a reservoir in the mountain north of the camp. The water supply had failed, and the camp staff blamed this on, quote, vandals. Upon investigations of the extensive water lines by the Eagles and the Rattlers as separate groups, they discovered that an outlet faucet had a sack stuffed into it. Almost all the boys gathered around the faucet to try to clear it. Suggestions from members of both groups concerning effective ways to unblock the obstruction were thrown in from all sides simultaneously, which led to a cooperative effort clearing the obstacle itself. The joint work on the faucet lasted for over 45 minutes. When the water finally came on, there was a common rejoicing. The Rattlers did not object to having the Eagles get ahead of them when they all got a drink, as the Eagles did not have canteens with them and were thirstier. No protests or ladies first type of remarks were made. The problem of securing a movie. The next superordinate goal to be introduced was a favorite feature-length movie for boys of their age. 2 films had been chosen in consultation with children's movie experts and were brought to the camp along with other stimulus materials. In the afternoon, the boys were called together, and the staff suggested the possibility of watching either Treasure Island or Kidnapped. Both groups yelled approval of these films. After some discussion, one Rattler said, "Everyone wants Treasure Island, raise their hands." The majority of members in both groups gave enthusiastic approval to Treasure Island, even though a few dissensions were expressed to this choice. Then the staff announced that securing the film would cost $15 and the camp could not pay for the whole sum. After much discussion, it was suggested that both groups would pay $350 and the camp would pay the balance. This was accepted even though, as a couple of homesick Eagles had gone home, the contribution per person per group was unequal. At supper that night, there was no objection to eating together. Some scuffling and sticking chewing gum on each other occurred between members of the two groups, but it involved fewer boys on both sides that were usually involved in such encounters. Other problem-solving superordinate goals introduced in this phase included the joint use of a tug-of-war rope, and both groups of boys accidentally came across a stuck-in-a-rut truck carrying food for both groups. In the event, the joint pursuit of such superordinate goals saw a lessening of the intergroup conflict. At breakfast and lunch on the last day of camp, the seating arrangements were considerably mixed up insofar as group membership was concerned. The theory that was solidified by the classic Robbers Cave experiment is realistic conflict theory. 3 key points from this are: 1. Resource scarcity and competition. When groups perceive that they compete for limited resources, hostilities can arise. 2. Formation of in-group and out-group dynamics. Through competition, groups develop a strong sense of us, in-group, versus them, out-group. This distinction can lead to negative stereotyping and increased animosity. 3. Superordinate goals. Intergroup hostility can be reduced when conflicting groups collaborate on goals that neither group can achieve on its own. These goals supersede their smaller individual goals and encourage cooperation. Now, that is the author of what I'm reading from here. That is his opinion on this, Mr. Sunshine here. But I'm quite familiar with this experiment. They also tried intermixing the 2 groups. So you've got 6 boys from the Rattlers, 6 boys from the Eagles. And I don't remember exact percentages, but it was somewhere around like 50% of the boys really didn't care. They got over it and, okay, now we're hanging out together. But then the other 50% of the boys, they still couldn't stand the other team. No, you were a Rattler, I was an Eagle, and I don't care if we're working on a common goal now, you were the enemy. And see, that's the thing about the sliminess of the true enemies to America, is they can pose this as an experiment for conflict resolution. No, we only pitted the boys against each other so that we could prove that once you use a superordinate goal afterwards, that they will come together and achieve that goal. Well, yes, for a certain percentage of them, that will happen. But these researchers are not blind to the fact that for the other 50% of them, you will never get past that barrier. Even though that kid right there is virtually identical to me in every way, economic class, religion, and race, he's a loser, screw him, he was an Eagle. Now, add in the differences between economic classes, religions, and race. And you're probably going to raise the percentage of lifelong animosity towards one another to 80 to 90%. Now just look at professional sports. You take 2 virtually identical guys that meet in a bar and they're talking, what do you do for a living? Oh, I work in a steel plant. Oh, really? Me too. You married? Yep, got 2 beautiful kids. Really? Me too. You like baseball? Oh yeah, man, lifetime Yankees fan. F you! Red Sox rule, get the hell out of here now. Blah, 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 blah. Ruckus wasn't quite sure what to make of that. But you see what I mean? These are billion-dollar sports franchises that are not just operating for financial gain off of you, but also for psychological gain off of you. They don't give a single F about you and will never do a single thing to help you in your life. But people are willing to fight at the drop of a hat because I'm a Rattler and he's an Eagle. And it will always be this way. But that's not enough. We're going to secure federal funding, and we're going to make sure that every school in America has sports ball teams with mascots and their own school colors and their own flags, metaphorically speaking. And these dumb town folks are going to hail us as heroes for us allowing their kids to participate in a little bit of friendly competition. And now, virtually identical kids that live in 2 towns 15 miles apart from each other will never trust each other and won't want anything to do with those losers up the road. And this is just a perfect example of how they take something that is actually quite nefarious and disguise it as a blessing bestowed on the peons. But let me tell you what the researchers at Yale and their financiers took away from this. The events at Robbers Cave mimicked the kinds of conflict that plague people all over the world. The simplest explanation for this conflict is competition. Assign strangers to groups, throw the groups into competition, stir the pot, and soon there is conflict. There's a lot of evidence that when people compete for scarce resources, ergo jobs, land, etc., there is a rise in hostility between groups. For example, in times of high unemployment, there may be high levels of ethnicism between wheat people who believe that blick people have taken their jobs. Case in point, when Henry Ford brought in a bunch of marginalized Southerners as union gangbusters in the auto plants, and it eventually spilled over into the Detroit ethnicity riots. No, it wasn't perceived that someone else was taking their jobs. They were taking their jobs. And they know this principle damn good and well. It's still happening today. Ethical issues must also be considered. The participants were deceived as they did not know the true aim of the study. Also, participants were not protected from physical and psychological harm, nor should the results be generalized to real life because the research only used 12-year-old white middle-class boys. Yeah, but they know damn good and well that the results would have been 10 times worse had you pitted white middle-class boys against inner-city black kids. Now, something else I found while researching this is the guy that wrote the script for Lost Boys. He 100% knew about this study. Like I said, it's one of the most extensively cited studies on Earth. But he decided to contact some of the men that had been part of this study as boys. And let me read you this. It never occurred to me that the children in Sharif's research hadn't been told later that they were being studied. And I would be unexpectedly in the situation of having to explain the experiment to them and tell them something about the man behind it. It must have been strange enough for them to receive an email from me out of the blue, but it was weirder still to have someone tell you that 60 years ago you were experimented on. It raised more questions for the boys than I had answers for, and I felt guilty, grubby, for having inadvertently started a process where they began to re-examine their lives in view of this new information. I felt compelled to find answers to their questions as a form of debriefing for an experiment they had been involved in over 60 years earlier. So there's millions and millions of people that know about this experiment. It's discussed in universities worldwide. And these men were 70 years old at the writing of this and had no idea that they had been part of an experiment as children. But why should that be a surprise? We got a whole nation of adults that don't realize they're part of an ongoing experiment. Static out.